There we go. Meeting is being recorded. Okay. You're good to go, Elizabeth.
All right. Good morning. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Almer, Chair of the Board of Accountancy Pipeline Committee. I am calling this public meeting to order. Today is Thursday, December 14th, 2023, and the time is 8:12 a.m. This meeting is being held via Zoom video and it is being recorded. Be sure to mute your mic through Zoom. When you want to speak, please use the raise your hand or use your hand. Please raise your hand or use the raise your hand feature and unmute when called upon and mute yourself when done speaking. Committee members, board liaison, and support staff can ask to speak at any time. For any members of the public observing this meeting, please use the public comment opportunity the committee will extend at each meeting unless specifically called upon. If you have public comment, please limit it to the topic of the committee's work. Please do not use the chat room for any discussions. Should any technical issues arise, we will pause the meeting until they are resolved. I will now take a roll call of members and guests. We have Mark Medema present, Scott Wright, member of the, Mark is a member of the committee, Scott Wright, member of the, am I doing this okay?
Yeah, normally we let people kind of respond at their
So. All right, there we go. Thank you for the correction. Mark?
You're muted, Mark.
He's working on it. Mark, you're still on mute.
Oh, I'm here. Yes.
We'll come back to you, Mark, when you get yourself unmuted there.
Or... Oh, I thought I had.
Got it. Okay, got it. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Scott?
Present by Zoom.
Scott Wright. Cynthia Killingsworth, member of the committee.
Here.
And Sherry McPherson, guest.
Present.
Martin Pittione.
Martin Pittione, Executive Director for the board, present by Zoom.
And our Board of Accountancy staff.
Present, Marilyn Gardner, board staff.
Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for making an early meeting. So we're going to start working through our agenda. The first item on our agenda is to review and adoption of the agenda. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
I make a motion to move the agenda as presented.
Second?
I'll second.
Thank you. All right. So then we have an opportunity for public comment. Sherry, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nothing of substance other than thank you very much to the board for creating the pipeline committee and Elizabeth for stepping up to chair it. And I look forward to supporting the committee in any way possible from OSCPA's perspective. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move into work session. The first item on our work session is an update on the financial aid research from the committee chair. So at our last meeting, we had a discussion that was led by our member from UP, Claire Costin, where she raised the issue that under their university's structure, it is possible that the grants from any scholarships from an outside organization could actually have just a net effect on funding their students because it may reduce the tuition discounts provided by their university. So that raised a bit of an alarm bell with us. It's a bit of a different situation for the most part at the public universities. So I went ahead and I contacted our folks at PSU in financial aid to get a better understanding of what was going on. And I did receive a great outline from our director of financial aid, and I'll give you the summary of it. The short answer is that at a public university, there are the bulk of the financial aid that students receive is actually tied to need-based financial aid as determined by the federal government and the students' FAFSAs. So depending on the specific package that a student has, from the information I was provided, it is more common at PSU and public institutions that the student's financial aid would not be adversely affected in any way by the receipt of a scholarship. There are some circumstances under which that could happen. And what it really boils down to is the public universities typically don't do these tuition discounts in the same way that a private university does. So private universities have a sticker price, and the vast majority of students will receive some discount off of that. So the rules are fairly complicated. And quite frankly, when I spoke with Martin about this, I said, I think what we need to do is see if we can get a meeting. Martin and I can get a meeting with financial aid from PSU, because all the public schools are going to work basically the same. So a meeting from financial aid from a public school, and then from UP private school, get us all in a room so that Martin and I really have a solid understanding of not just the circumstances under which a student's financial aid package could be adversely affected. Well, I don't want to say adversely. I think that's a little bit strong, but could be affected by the scholarships. And then understand the scope of that. While I have the sort of the laundry list of the different circumstances that students could be in, we don't yet have a sense of, is it common at a public university for a student to have an offsetting reduction in their discount to tuition? So the worst case scenario on this is that if a student did have some kind of a reduction, it may come out in either the tuition discount or in a reduction of loan eligibility. So we need to understand this a little bit better. So we will report back on this. Our goal is to get a meeting with these folks, financial aid folks, hopefully before our next meeting in January. The holidays get a little bit strange with the universities, so it's a little hard to get a meeting right away. Cynthia, I am curious if what your insights might be at the community colleges. My sense is they should be the same as the rest of the public schools, but I just wanted to double check with you.
I think I'll follow up. I found that information on our website about it, but I'll follow up with our financial aid people and before our next meeting and see if I can get some more information after hearing what you said. But the one thing I was thinking about that made sense when I was thinking about this more is the worst case scenario is it reduces their student loans, which has an impact on our students' lives in the long run, is that debt reduction, and it opens up their ability to continue their education more.
Yeah, just at the bottom line, tuition non-need based discounts are exceptionally rare in a public school, whereas they are quite common in a private school to get some kind of a tuition discount. That's just the model. It's just like the model that you see in certain stores. You never pay full price because you always know there's a sale coming. That's kind of the way private schools pricing model works. So, okay, so I don't view this as a huge hindrance. This is really just, we want to be absolutely certain that we understand the minutia of financial aid, which is incredibly complicated, before, just so we have full information as a committee. Any other questions from committee members? All right. Okay, so moving on then to our next item in our work session. We want to continue the items that were listed from our previous meeting on October 27th. That meeting, we had a very free-flowing and robust discussion that I think really helped everybody get on the same page. But it really, I think from a committee perspective, it would be helpful for us to have actually a written objective that we all feel comfortable with, as well as have specific goals to achieve that objective and come up with a timeline. So hopefully you all have had an opportunity to look at the draft objectives and goals development that were sent out by Martin. Does everybody have that? Okay, well then I'm going to open it up and just ask for feedback on the overall committee objective, which again, this is very much in draft form. Martin and I just thought we would take a first pass at it as a starting point. And so what we've drafted is to establish a scholarship stream from surplus Board of Accountancy funds aimed at Oregon College and University students with financial need who intend to pursue an accounting degree. So what are our thoughts on this?
I have a question. So one of the things that I thought about afterwards is one of the objective ends with an accounting degree. Now, not everybody gets an accounting degree, ends up becoming a certified public accountant, which is the purview of the board, or a public accounting certificate. So are we funding folks just to get an accounting degree, or is the goal, hopefully, that they will in fact get certified in some fashion, a license in some fashion?
Well, I think that's a point. So I was expecting 2 points of discussion in this, and that was the first one. The other one was the financial need.
Which is another question I have. Yeah.
Right. So just thinking about this, and I went back and forth before I shipped my first draft to Martin, and here's where I absolutely agree. The purview of the board is to get more CPAs. The first step along the way is an accounting degree. And if we are funding from the 2-year college level moving forward, I struggled a bit with this notion that you're asking somebody to raise their hand and say, who's a sophomore at PCC or any other community college, to raise their hand and say, I want to get I want to get my CPA. So the idea was that my thought was, do we want to be saying that so narrowly? The concern is whether we're precluding people from applying for the scholarship if they say, as a sophomore, my goal is to get just to get that 4-year degree because I can't think any bigger than that. I don't know. And I think this is open for discussion.
Well, certainly if you're going to get a license, whether PA or CPA, I mean, getting the accounting degree is almost a necessity. I mean, there are other fashions, but in Oregon, it's pretty close to a necessity. So that certainly is a step in the process. I don't know if additional language being with a goal of getting licensure or something, I don't even know what it is, but I guess that's a question, and maybe the educators know, or maybe has anybody in research, how many people get accounting degrees that do not then get a license of some fashion? Is it 50%?
At least
10%?
At least 50%.
Okay.
And if you look at national statistics, you can see that it's actually a minority that become CPAs.
Okay.
Cynthia?
Yeah, I was the degree worried me too, because community college students often don't see themselves as 4-year students when they start out. Some do, and that's awesome. And some are looking down the road. I'm going to get a 4-year degree. I'm going to get a CPA. But that is really the minority. I have a long list of students that started out saying, I just want to get one of our certificates in accounting. And we coax them along the way as they discover the success that they're having and how much they enjoy the coursework. And they end up deciding very, far into their time at PCC that they're going to be university transfers. So I do think that accounting degree might be a little limiting. And it could be accounting focus or something more general like that. Accounting field of study. I don't know the wording, but.
So I'm actually starting to draft some alternate potential language here, so I don't lose my thought. So when I'm looking off to the right, I'm just working on my other screen here with some other language. I'm still listening. I think the way I had originally formulated this, and then I'll Martin comment, is we want to get more students in that funnel. And if we are trying to just target students, for example, already in the 4-year universities, our problem is we can't get enough students to start. And that's what I'm a little bit worried about. Doesn't mean we can't modify this language, but I think that there's some of this, and this is a big piece, and this is really why I wanted to have this conversation, is I picked up at our first meeting that there was definitely not yet consensus on where are we targeting.
Yeah.
Martin?
So if I don't want to, weigh in too far on the substantive side of this. So I want to phrase this as a question, because I originally had exactly the same reaction that Scott did. It's like, okay, isn't the objective, because I'm coming with a board head, isn't the objective, ultimately a CPA credential, and don't we want to emphasize that? But I backed off for the various reasons that we've just heard discussed. What I'm wondering is, what's the relationship between the language that we're discussing right now and the other parts of the committee's work, where we're going to talk about, how we actually structure some of the scholarships? And here's what I'm after, right? What I'm after is, if you have a more generic overall statement that essentially allows you to be a little bit broader in reach earlier in the pipeline, right, where you're not making it a criterion right from the start that they have to know the first time that they're taking an accounting course that they're going to end up pursuing a CPA credential, would that still open up, if we kind of take that more general approach in that initial statement, wouldn't we still be able to, as part of the structuring later, to say, hey, certain parts of these scholarships might be targeted toward, at that point, it's really about, you need to be in the CPA pipeline, or this is about reimbursing you for costs for the CPA exam, or whatever it is. I mean, I'm not sure that those two things necessarily would exclude each other. So that's kind of the way I started thinking about it. Again, not trying to tell the committee where we should land, but that's essentially kind of how my thinking started to evolve, because I agree with Scott that we would love from the board side to have more CPAs, right? And on the other hand, I don't want to, do anything that would kind of, shut off the funnel early on by being too specific. And that's, I think, what the struggle here is.
Martin, can I share my screen?
Sure.
I just want to make sure that that's allowable, and that
Yeah,
it's allowable, and that that I can be and
yeah,
it can be
do you
because
have
that might be
sharing rights
helpful.
right now, or Marilyn, do you need to give her sharing rights?
I need to get sharing rights. Currently, it's I don't have them.
So let me, while we're looking at that, let me ask this, I guess, as a question, because we're setting the objectives. How long do we envision this committee existing? I mean, multiple years, or are we going to wrap up our work by the end of June, for example, 24? Because if the question would be, as long as we all understand that, Martin, what you're talking about is we don't want to limit it now, but if this committee is going to go multiple years into the future, do we need to have a little more there so that future committee members understand the whole goal is to try to get people into the certificates?
So if I may, Elizabeth, if I can take that on for a minute, are you good with me taking that on?
Yes, absolutely.
So I actually had a very similar discussion with our board chair related to your question, Scott, because I was trying to wrap my head around, similar dynamics for this committee. And so there's a couple of things I can share in response, right? Right now, this committee, in terms of its charge, is really specifically limited to this: how do we get this program set up and running, right? What do we need to do legislatively? What do we need to do contract-wise? There is currently no vision or discussion at the board level to kind of have a more ongoing role for this committee, right? So what that means is that the first answer to your question is, Scott, is that this committee is meant to sunset when the work is done. The more open question is, when are we actually going to be done with that work, right? Because it really has multiple parts, right? There is the initial building of what it looks like, and at minimum, it includes, hey, here is what the committee is working on and has worked on and achieved in terms of, for example, negotiating an actual contract with OSCPA, right? Which to me implies, since we are, and this is just me saying this, that people can push back on this, right? So I would say that on a very concrete level, this committee couldn't dissolve in 2024 already, because number one, the legislative work needs to be done in 2025, right? Hopefully with support of the committee. And then the issue is, are we going to walk into the legislative session already having that contract ready, right? Basically saying we know exactly what we're getting, right? And that, of course, for me would be an ideal scenario if we could already, if we already have it that far, right? Because if we get all that work done, it would mean maybe by the time the legislature convenes, we are done, right? But what I'm not exactly sure what the end point is, but I do feel like the committee needs to at least get us to the point where we have that initial contract in place and essentially get through, know what it is that we actually bring into the legislative session for 2025, right? So I hope that answers at least a part of your question, Scott.
Yep.
So I don't know, can you all see my screen with my Word document? So given this conversation, I italicized a few things that I changed that maybe are moving us a little closer in that direction with the guidance of Martin, with thinking about how do we broaden this. So to establish a scholarship stream from surplus Board of Accountancy funds aim primarily, and I thought of this after the agenda and everything had come out, that maybe we don't want to be so narrow as to say it only goes to students with financial need. We don't know. Maybe not enough students with financial need apply, because that is historically a problem, is getting enough students to apply for scholarships. So aim primarily at Oregon. Well, the primarily is in the wrong place. I want to put a qualifier on financial need. Who are pursuing higher education in accounting. Does that get us to a closer space? Because operationally, there can absolutely be a greater allocation to students who are pursuing that 5th year. That doesn't need to be, that level of discretion, I think, can be in there, but we could put some more language that pursuing higher education in accounting and a preference for those intending to become CPAs. Do you see where I'm going with that? I'm open to hearing what other thoughts people have on how we can kind of modify this, because it is about making sure there's enough breadth to impact the whole funnel, but also the specificity that the discretion of the granting organization to shift those based upon where the applications are.
So you had in your draft there, you had primarily at Oregon colleges, and you said, no, that was primarily for financial need. So maybe that's what we do is you were talking about having the qualifier at the end primarily for those seeking a certified public accounting license, but also put financial need there, because
I just had it in the wrong place.
Yeah,
I wanted to be clear it was Oregon, and I put it before Oregon, and it was in the wrong place. So students, let's see, Oregon College and University students, preferably with a financial need. Who are pursuing higher education in accounting. Maybe I just say, oh, Cynthia, do you have a suggestion?
Well, I was just going to say, this is just setting the intention of the board and not necessarily, because my concern was down the road, we're seeing things evolve, like the accounting certificate that the IMA and the AICPA are creating, where we're maybe seeing alternatives to funding the pipeline crisis in addition to CPA certification. But I don't know if that really matters right here for the intention of our board, right? If we're looking long-term and wanting a lasting description of where these funds should be going, my concern is we're in an evolving time where we're not quite sure where certification is going to be going in the long run to address the pipeline crisis. Does that make sense? But I don't know if that's important right here, because it's just like, what is the goal of the board at the moment?
Well, but I do think it's important. I really did want to spend some time on this, because what this boils down to is this sets we need to set some very broad guidelines here that are sufficiently flexible for the granting organization. So whoever's granting these at the end, we need to be sure that they have this broad guidance, but the ability to be flexible, like you say, Cynthia, as circumstances change. But I guess the two pieces of this that I want to be certain we have committee agreement are preference for financial need. That we have that is an agreement with the committee. And again, that goes to the governor's office's strong request that this have a diversity impact. And like I said, I can recall seeing a professor's child get a lot of scholarship money and knowing that student did not need a penny of it because they were going to school on a reduced tuition. 30% of sticker price. And so that's the kind of thing that I want. I think that, we talked about this. This is not for the top performing students. That other scholarship was for top performing students. We say nothing about performance in here. And so I think that's the kind of thing. If the granting organization wants to then make a further layer with performance, that's kind of up to them, but we're very clearly saying financial need is the biggest piece here. Because that's how we can get at diversity. We can't get at diversity by saying diversity. Martin? Thoughts on that? Am I characterizing that correctly from the governor's office?
From the governor's office perspective, I can just reiterate what I said to this committee earlier. They are very, very keen on, they're very excited about this, but they were also very clear that they want to see a framework that can reasonably be essentially, if you will, tested or be held accountable for. This will have impacts that will help diversify the pipeline coming, essentially through the system. They didn't get super specific about that, whether they were talking about diversity of folks that ultimately reach CPA licensure versus diversity of folks that are receiving the funding. I think it's the latter. But that was a very, very clear feedback message that I don't think is tempering the excitement at the governor's office, but they are very supportive of this work, but they were also very clear about that angle.
Scott, you look like you have a comment.
In terms of the goals of this committee, I think this covers it. Again, the idea that things may evolve in the future, the board may come to a different decision, all those pieces. But I think as far as this committee, I think that's a good goal.
I don't love the way it's written right now. That could use a little wordsmithing, but that can be done as well offline and, through Martin circulating this to us for slightly better wording. But just to confirm, we're in agreement that there should be something in there about preference for financial need and that it should be very broad. I actually do like the language because this does accommodate what Cynthia is saying. And we see the same thing all the time. Students come in just wanting their four-year degree and then they rock it with their education. And we pull them aside by the scruff of their neck and say, come on, you need to go all the way. I mean, this is typical for faculty to do. So this language, who are pursuing higher education and accounting, seems to take care of being very inclusive for what levels this can go to. And then the language is not, the wording is not quite right, but preferably professional licensure. What that I think does is it sends a signal that maybe more funding goes to those students to get them that last fifth year, for example. But again, we don't know how things are going. That fifth year, although I don't think so, it could go away. Martin?
Yeah. So, and if I may, one of the things that I'm also testing for in here is we talked a lot about the folks that are coming in originally and that, maybe doing accounting, but didn't really think about licensure, and then they do great. And, you have to pull them aside and saying, hey, let's give you a talking to. What that doesn't yet capture is this other population that I think we're also after, which is the folks that actually originally go to school for something other than accounting, and then they come back later in life. And, in fact, I actually believe that our current board chair is one of them, if I remember correctly. I think he was an engineering student, right? And then I think he ended up doing a master's program in accounting to essentially get to the place that he needed to be as a CPA. And I believe that language here is flexible enough that it could also help attract those that essentially come to this pretty late in the game. And that's also important to me.
That's great. And that, like, for example, we have a very robust post-bac certificate program. And in fact, there's partners all over the state that did that. So that's because that's a great point. If we said degree, the certificate doesn't handle that. Okay, so for the committee members present, I want to be certain that this can go out, that Martin can send this out to the rest of the committee, and they're going to watch this recording. So I guess for everybody, both those on the recording and in the Zoom today, is everybody comfortable with this being the principles that we're trying to get across, but maybe just needs a little more wordsmithing?
I am
I like
comfortable with
it.
that.
Yeah, and can I just say too, my thought is I like this, but trying to think back when I was a student, way back in the dark ages, even, if the OSCPA picks up this program, who you apply to it for, to me is going to have that mental of, oh, I should be thinking about a CPA. And to me as a student, you're going to be looking at the OSCPA as kind of that body of, oh, this means I'm going to be a CPA, or at least it's something I'm seriously considering. But maybe that's just me.
No, I think you're absolutely right. But I also think, I'm glad, Sherry, that you're here, because I think that raises some points about, in the administration of this, having a really robust committee at the foundation that is aware of what's going on at the universities and within the population, so that this can be, that the advertising of this scholarship can be very strategically handled. So for example, something as simple as saying, this is for degree seeking students at the associates, bachelor's, master's, and post-bac certificates. That's really the operationalization of it. But again, that can change with what happens in the marketplace. Okay. All right. I feel like we're in a pretty good spot, so I'll ask for if there's any additional comments on this. Okay. Well, then what I will do is Martin, I'll get you this document, and then you can distribute this out to the rest of the committee members for a little bit of final wordsmithing. Something tells me Logan will be really good at this based on my previous experience with him. All right. So the next item on our work session is to establish a non-voting liaison to OSCPA's Educational Foundation from the Educational Foundation to attend our meetings. So Martin, can you handle this one? The process for this?
I can, but I also, since Sherry is present, I'm hoping to do it simply jointly with her. I simply want to confirm for the committee that I've had the initial conversations with OSCPA to establish that presence. Sherry has assured me that that's in the works, and that hopefully no later than our next meeting in January, that we will have kind of a clearer picture of how we can make sure that we have somebody from OSCPA at the table from the Education Foundation side at the table, so that we have that, quite frankly, that interplay. Number one, the expertise about how the program currently works, and quite frankly, have somebody in the room when we need to get to the conversations about here is what we need and what we're working on, and essentially have OSCPA directly there when we're talking about things that might need to be different for at least this part of the Education Foundation operations forward that are funded through this funding stream. So yeah, it's gotten going. I don't know, Sherry, if you have anything more specific to add to that, but I just want to confirm that we're not asleep at the switch, that has gotten rolling.
I'm in agreement. And Elizabeth, as you know a lot of detail about the foundation from your background. Tana Hollis will be, maybe not at every meeting, but she'll be actively involved as well. And for
Great.
everyone else on the Board of Accountancy's Pipeline Committee, Tana Hollis has worked, she's on staff here. She's 27-year staff member, and she is like the very right hand of the Ed Foundation, very knowledgeable with a lot of history and depth. So we'll have her available as much as we possibly can and when needed.
Yep. And then I've also discussed with Sherry that, I don't know how far Tana can go when we're talking about potential policy issues for the Education Foundation, so that as needed, we may need to pull in possibly somebody who's actually on the board as opposed to staff level. I don't know when that need will arise, but I think the day-to-day in terms of this committee is probably, I think that most of it probably Tana can handle, but I didn't want to give Sherry a guarantee that every issue that comes up with Tana is going to feel comfortable handling depending on what it is.
Correct. There are some issues that may need to go to the board for policy setting.
Yeah.
So that makes sense.
Okay, so we have a timeline on that by our next meeting.
Yes, and I'll be very active as well, but I just wanted to mention Tana.
Okay. All right, thank you. We actually handled the second one, and the timeline on that is that Martin, so clarify financial aid student impacts through scholarship funding. And so Martin and I will attempt to have a little bit more granular understanding of this by our next meeting. And so number 3, this is really what I'm going to turn this back over to you, Martin, on the establishing a subcommittee with Scott and Mark, working with you to develop a potential fiscal framework. Is there anything, do you want to just kind of share a little bit more about that and what that would look like for the rest of us?
Yes, so I'm just want to make sure that I'm off mute. So unlike the piece with respect to Sherry, I have not had a chance to reach out specifically to Scott and Mark yet. All they have for me right now is essentially fair warning with little opportunity to opt out, is I think the way I would characterize it. That I would love to work with them. And I did also get as far as discussing with the treasurer of our board, Jason, that we will need his help. By the way, that comes with a little bit of an asterisk. So Jason Robinson, our current treasurer board member, we do have officer elections tomorrow. So I may have to work with somebody other than Jason if there is a change in that position. Right, but I will know who that person is by 5 p.m. tomorrow. And my goal is to, quite frankly, start that work in mid-January, because then I will have hopefully a bit more of also, quite frankly, data through the end of December. I should have, fiscal data through the end of December by mid-January, basically by MLK, in my system. And then I feel a lot more comfortable starting to work on things like revenue projections, updated projections, and so on. My hope is that we could, sorry, I've got a very active four-legged friend here right now. My hope is that I could, probably in the 3rd or 4th week of January, if we could find some time, Scott, before things get really crazy, on the accounting side to do an initial thing, because I know that availability, particularly on your end, will diminish come February.
Yeah, that's fine. And actually, where I am right now it won't be that bad. So anytime would be fine, even into March.
Yeah. And then Mark, it just depends on your definition of retirement. And I've learned from CPAs that their definition of retirement varies broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I have this side gig. I do TurboTax Help Desk. I really enjoy it. Because to me, it's people try to, do a DIY kind of thing, and some of them just have not a clue what they're doing, and it's you just walk them through, and I feel like I sometimes want to just say, hey, I'd like to, but so anyway, but yes, I'm very flexible. I control my own schedule. I work here at home, so you give me a few days time, and I definitely can make my schedule work for any meeting, Zoom or here in Salem. Just
So my goal timeline is that we have like an initial meeting done by the end of January for this stuff.
So I just want to clarify, is this going to establish the amount of funds that are available, or is it the amount and also come with some recommendations from the subcommittee as to how over what time frame this will be distributed? Because we just have briefly said, well, we don't know if it, how many, for example, how many years is the initial amount going to be spread over? Is the full amount going to be transferred? Is there discretion on how many years over which, do we want to allow the OSCPA discretion over how many years they spread this over? Those types of issues, is that part of what you're going to come back with recommendations on?
There are three pieces right now
Okay.
that I see in all of this. And quite frankly, all of them ultimately are at the pleasure of the board. So as with all committees, it becomes a recommendation to the board. So the board has to be the final decision maker. But as with, so many matters, the board really prefers, experts to dig in and come to it with a recommendation. There are three pieces. One you mentioned, which is let's get enough of a sense of the board's fiscal condition and kind of what it might do, and this is unfortunately tied a little bit to the board's work that has to happen simultaneously the first 6 months of next year, which is pulling together its agency request budget for 25-27, right? Mark is very familiar with that dynamic. So part of this is about establishing the amount. The second piece is the one that you mentioned around the timelines for the distribution, right? But there is a third piece in all of this. And that piece also will not surprise Mark and Scott. And I think I've mentioned it at this committee as well, which is to also look at that inside that how much issue is this super potent, from my perspective anyway, issue of whether, unlike the model that we received from Washington State, we go beyond a one-time distribution to also a recommendation that, for example, potentially the interest income on the board's fund balance could be used on an ongoing basis as a dedicated source to keep this alive beyond a one-time piece, right? So those are really the three big points. They're not all going to come necessarily at the same time, but those are the things that at least I want to start the work on, because my guess is, and Mark, feel free to weigh in because you're deep in the weeds on these processes, right? My sense is that the most sensible and powerful way for the fiscal piece of the subcommittee to work is if we do it at the same time as the 25-27 budget gets developed, which is essentially in that first 6 months, because that has to be essentially blessed by the board no later than its June meeting. That has to include what we call a policy option package to fund this legislative proposal, right? That has to be documented and written up by June, right? So my goal is to start the work at the end of January, but I also know that there will be additional pieces that will have to be put together so that we can get to a place where we can first come back to this committee with a lot more developed work around that fiscal piece that then can come to a committee recommendation of, hey, this is what we want to take to the June board to support one portion of what the board needs to consider as part of its 25-27 budget request. So I hope that makes sense timeline wise. And I hope, Mark, that makes sense to you as well, since you're really deep in that process.
Yes. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, that was kind of my mind was going around getting that policy option package and then the legislative piece, getting that through getting it prepared by DOJ to send over to the legislature so they can start looking at it also. So yeah, it's a multi-month process getting the budget ready for not only the governor's budget, but then the next 6 months moving it through the legislature.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. All right. So I guess that both Mark and Scott have agreed to be on this subcommittee. And so, Martin, that is the three of you who will be working on that piece of it. Thank you very much. I'm sure this is going to be a heavy lift. So deep appreciation there for both the work as well as both of your expertise on this. We're very fortunate to have you helping us on this.
3 of us plus the treasurer. Just want to put that on the record.
Yes, 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 plus the treasurer. Yeah. Any other comments on that before we move on to item number 4? All right. So as I go through this, I actually think that item number 4 and item number 6 are really related to one another. So we might want to discuss those two together. So 4 is to develop a pipeline of impact goals through the enhanced scholarship funding. And 6 is to create an accountability/data framework to demonstrate the impact on diversity in the CPA candidate pipeline. And I will tell you, on some of these items, I had a very clear idea of what I thought, where I thought we should be going. And this one, I will tell you, I don't have a clear idea. This is really a tough one. What this is really asking us to do, and it is something we need to do, which is understanding how we determine whether this program is a success or not. And so and I will tell you that the majority of scholarship programs do not do any success tracking. That has been my experience over my 25 plus years in academia. The money gets granted. It's called a success if it's granted to students that meet the criteria of the scholarship. But the feedback loop on that is very, very rare. So with that said, I feel like this is a terrific opportunity for folks who who may just come at it with a fresh, less jaded view than me to really just have a free-flowing discussion of ideas. So with that, I'm going to stop. And Cynthia, it looks like you were starting to raise your hand. All right, why don't we start with Cynthia?
Especially number 6, I think number 6, our data tracking at the universities and community colleges, I can see being leveraged for this potentially. And I'm not sure of how they can share with outside. So we'd have to sort that out too, how the information can be shared externally. But especially the diversity piece, we'd have to think through. We've got the tools to do this, right? But how we can use them for this. Do you have much information about how information can be shared externally?
At a student level, not.
Not at a student level. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
But just the data.
I think it'll be very tough. Here's the one piece that I think we could do is there certainly could be questions that are voluntary that are asked of the students on their applications. So there can be aggregate data that could be reported back to the governor's office about who applied versus who receives scholarships. Furthermore, the universities should be able to provide us with aggregate data on the demographics of students in each of their programs. So for example, I can absolutely share, I can obtain and share out data on the percentage of students that indicate to PSU their underrepresented, what their racial status. So that data I can absolutely get, and it gets shared out with our advice. You've seen it at our advisory board, Cynthia. So the best I could get to is we know what the universities currently look like demographically. We could know what our applicant pool looks like demographically. And then we could take a look at what our scholarship recipients look like demographically. And we similarly could do the same thing with financial need. You know, my focus on financial need and our overall goal was because if you say financial, it's a Venn diagram. And where that Venn diagram is depends upon which school you're at and a lot of different factors. But that is, I feel like that's the best we can get to. Now, how do we track that all the way to whether it impacts the CPA pipeline? That's the piece I can't get to.
I was thinking something similar. Our Office of Institutional Effectiveness does have this aggregate data, and I could see where we could leverage that.
That would be amazing, because this is the part where I would really, really struggle the most in terms of figuring out the data end of the equation.
Elizabeth, you made the comment that the university or PSU, I'm presuming you're referring to that, would be able to give a demographics of the scholarship recipients. Is that in general, or would they be able to focus purely then on those that are funded through this program?
I don't know that we track scholarship recipients by demographic data, because that would require a integration of financial aid data with a registration data, which are two separate databases. And I don't know the answer to that because I've never seen that data integrated. I could imagine that's a problematic thing, potentially from a structural standpoint and potentially from a just strategy standpoint, whether the university wants to do that. I don't know.
Okay.
But what we can do is we can say what percentage of declared accounting majors fit into each of these demographic buckets. And then the OSCPA would know what the pool looks like because they can ask the question. Now, students can choose to not answer it. Always, they can choose to not answer it. But of those students who respond, they could say what their pool looks like. Our hope would be, and I don't know that it matters whether the pool is, you know, I think there's a question, you know, does, you know, we look at what the pool looks like. Hopefully that pool is more diverse than our schools. And then when you look at the scholarship recipients, if there is a preference on financial need, to the extent that financial need is a surrogate for diversity, which it is somewhat, but not 100%, you should see more scholarship recipients there. But, you know, a big key with this too is, you know, and I don't think we've said this explicitly, but I think this will come in when we talk about number 5. It's not on there currently, but you know, the big difference, I think that what we've been talking about here is these are more need-based. These are not performance-based scholarships. And that really distinguishes it from certainly what the OSCPA does currently, and it distinguishes it from what most university scholarships are. There's financial need-based based aid. Scholarships are generally merit-based. And if we were to go in and do a merit-based scholarship and follow that model, we would not achieve our diversity goals, I guarantee you. And the reason why is these students simply, it takes them longer to get up to speed. They're not coming from, you know, I mean, at a bare minimum, we see the difference, and I'm sure you do too, Cynthia. at what the K through 12 looks like. And that does not dictate whether somebody's going to be a successful CPA or not. It just sometimes is a longer ramp. It takes them a little bit longer to get there.
Yeah, we have so many students. I mean, we have one student that's going with one of the big firms right now, but if you looked at his first round of college, and his GPA was just wrecked by that first round, and came back for a second round and perfect grade.
Yeah.
So he would be one of those people that would struggle with the merit-based
Right.
model.
Yeah. For inclusivity purposes, this really is about not doing this purely merit-based. I'm not saying that couldn't be a factor. I mean, you don't want somebody who you think they're not going to get through a program. But the reality is somebody who's a solid, 3.1 student, 3.0 student, oftentimes those become some of your very best CPAs. Those ones who have been working through school, supporting families, all of those things, they don't get merit-based scholarships. Doesn't mean they're not capable. I know this can be a little, I'm looking at some faces, and I know this goes counter to a lot of what we've talked about over, not just about what we talked about in here, but about what we as a profession typically say. We want to see the 3.5 or we don't want them.
Some of them become decent executive directors.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, would you like me to talk to our Office of Institutional Effectiveness and just kind of brainstorm with them a little bit of their ideas?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay, I will do that.
I see that we have an additional committee member joining. Good morning, Mary. It looks like you're connecting to audio. I think you had a rough morning with U of O's system down. Mary, could you just introduce yourself for the record?
Hi, my name's Mary Savage from University of Oregon, and very glad I was able to join the meeting.
All right. So Mary, just to catch you up, we're discussing items 4 and 6 in our work session. And for our goals development, those two really go together, which is talking about the short answer is, how do we assess whether this program is successful? Both in terms of getting more people out and getting to pursue accounting and a more diverse pool of individuals. Other thoughts from the committee on this? Scott, Mark?
No, I mean, I'm good with it. And I was just thinking way back into the mid 70s and that 3.0 and working and, doing all that stuff. And I'm like, yeah, I totally get it. And I think it's probably worse today than it was for me.
Infinitely with the cost of living and the cost of education. When I first came to PSU 20 years ago, a student living at home could work a part-time job, and between the financial aid and a part-time job, they could walk away without debt if they were careful. Absolutely can't happen anymore. Scott?
I guess I would say the ultimate test of success is how many more people ultimately end up in accounting. Now, that is far beyond how to quantify that and everything else, because there's so many factors that play into it besides simply that which we are financing other people into. But that ultimately is it. How many more people are in accounting, and specifically, again, with our purview, in public accounting. But yeah, that's I don't know how we can determine that with any timeline that's not multi-year.
Yeah. And that's a tricky one. I can think of specific students over the years that get a really big scholarship. And then, we think they're headed to public accounting, and the next thing we know, they're going to law school.
You could still end up being a CPA who specializes in tax with that law degree, but
potentially. But yeah, and we have students who occasionally will never finish a degree. I mean, there's all kinds. It's such a messy system to track. I mean, theoretically, there could be a tracking loop with these students. That puts a huge administrative burden on the granting organization. And additionally, you're going to have a terrible response rate on that. You know, people are hard to track over time. Okay, so it sounds like what we're hearing is the best thing we can do, you know, we are putting scholarship money out there. And here's the other thing, and I know, Martin, this probably doesn't, this is a bit of a thin thread here. But, you know, to the extent that we reduce the student loan burden for students, that's a very difficult one to measure because that's private information on their end. But that also reduces the burden of students needing to, when they graduate, be as focused on short-term compensation in their job. You know, I have heard my former students say, you know, I just couldn't pass up the job at fill in the blank outside of public accounting because of their burdensome student loans. That's not uncommon because we all know you can jump for at least 25% after 2 years. So that's a, you know, an intangible, but my hope is that some of that has an impact, at least on the margins.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If we can have an impact on debt reduction, I think that's worthy from a number of perspectives, including the pipeline impact, even though I agree measuring that will be a real challenge.
I don't think we can. Let me ask Sherry if she can weigh in here. Sherry?
Yes.
I have a vague recollection of years ago being on the OSCPA Foundation board, some conversation about what questions we could or would ask, and I swear we did something around. This was when Colleen Murray was on the board, and there was something around a racial background question. And if my memory serves right, that question was pulled off of the application because we were not using that data. I just have a vague memory of this. And so what I guess my question for you is, would OSCPA Foundation have any issues with asking that data to be disclosed voluntarily by recipients?
I don't remember the background of what you're saying related to Colleen, when Colleen was on there, but
She was active in the conversation.
yes, I'm trying to like reflect on what that was. But I mean, I guess I would say at first blush, I'm not sure what the concern would be if we were asking and it were an optional question. I'm thinking about, I haven't seen that application for a little while, so whether it's on there right now or not, but if it's optional
Okay.
and not, I mean,
Can I ask you for a follow-up on that? Because
yes.
really our tracking hinges on that.
Yes.
And maybe even it's something that is not part of if there's any concerns, that's not part of the information that is disclosed to the decision makers on the scholarships. But this is and so that would be the backup. This is a tracking issue because we can't, I don't know any other, I can't come up with any other, I've been worried about this the whole time. How do we come up with a way of tracking this?
Why don't I do this? Tana is just down the hall here, and I know she's not in a meeting. Why don't I just take myself offline real quick and go ask her if she knows if that's on there right now?
That'd be great.
Might be helpful to have that today. Be right back.
All right.
I've got a question, Elizabeth.
Yes, of course, Mary.
Well, sorry for coming in late, but I'm doing the best I can here. But are we addressing the fact that we want sort of mid-level students that may not be the best academically, but have, you know, they've got a single child or they've got, you know, working full time or anything like that? Because some of those people are really hardworking and end up being great employees.
Absolutely. And that's actually something that falls under the number 5, the key subtopics of
Okay.
what are the criteria.
Okay.
And I think you raise a really valid point. That's what I think this is intended for, because there is a tremendous amount of funding for very strong students. That's not the issue. The strong students are doing just fine getting through this. The issue is we want to encourage more people to go all the way through that CPA. And a lot of those students do excel, like you say. I mean, I hear this all the time from employers. How amazing somebody is. And it turns out that that's the student that, had that slightly lower GPA, but was juggling being a single parent and working full time. And now they're amazing because they know how to multitask. Sherry, what was your answer that you got?
Thank you very much. I was sure it was still on there. I just hated to affirm that without knowing for sure. Tana affirms that is still on there, and that means it's been on there a long time.
Good, good. Okay. I just remember some conversation around that.
Yes.
Scott?
So in today's world, there are so many intersections of diversity. You've asked about racial. I mean, is that the only one that we're going to get feedback on to the governor's office? Or we could spend hours and days trying to figure out what is it, but racial certainly is part of it. But what do we have any real guidances? What does that diversity that we're looking for mean? Is it purely racial, or is it all the 47 other self-identifications?
That and financial need are the only things that we have data on at universities.
But so again, we're saying diversity is racial only.
Martin?
I can't say that that's the case from the governor's perspective. They haven't been specific with me. I would be surprised if it was quite that narrow. I think they're interested in multiple layers. I don't know that we would have data to deal with multiple layers. For example, I don't know whether we would, have issues around, are we impacting more people outside, like in rural areas versus urban areas, right? This is another layer of diversity, right? I have no idea how we would come up with that, data. I think the piece of the data that we do have, but I do think we have less of an issue with now, is from my understanding from the data, is the whole male-female diversity, because I think that we already have the data that it's now like slightly more majority female in terms of accounting students, I think, is what the data currently shows. So I don't think we have a catch up in the student pipeline on the male-female kind of diversity. I think those diversity challenges come a little bit later in the profession in terms of, females actually taking on leadership positions, but that's a little bit outside the scope for the scholarship piece. So, but I don't want to encourage the sense that, the governor's office has been super specific about what it means when it says diversity, nor has it said that it's only looking at this from a racial perspective. I hope not. I don't think so, because I think that, for example, economic diversity, socioeconomic diversity should matter, for example, just as much.
I mean, a big one right now is neurodiversity. I mean, you can pick any number of diversity frameworks, and I guess I wouldn't want to spend our time focused on one area and then get pillared for not being cognizant of 3 others or 6 others or even 1 other.
Mark?
Well, I was just thinking, shouldn't we think about what kind of data we can gather? And, ethnicity right now, quite frankly, sexual identity is kind of one of those big things that are out there and, play in the politics. But I mean, think of the questions we can ask and then just kind of say, okay, which ones make sense to ask? And then obviously go with the foundation to say, are you comfortable asking this? And, how's that data going to look 5-10 years from now? But yeah, I don't think we want to just say, I mean, quite frankly, with all of the court cases and stuff, I wouldn't think we'd want just racial diversity, because that's been kind of shot down by the by the politics of the day as it is. So yeah, I just like the need-based thing, because I do think that gets us a diverse group, but it's not targeting at the racial level. We're focused on how can we help this person improve themselves when they're coming with a disadvantage. And I'm quite frankly, I'll just say this: I'm married to a Black guy, and that for me over the last 7 years, getting to understand what that means, I don't look at it. I didn't look at it as privilege, but at the same point in time, when you try and look from somebody else's shoes, yes, my kids had an advantage because they had, two parents with college degrees. They had parents who could earn money, who could help them go to school, who could help them with a car, who could help them with tuition, who could do those things for them, so that when, my son was like, yeah, I want to get a philosophy degree, and you could sit down and say, okay, how is that going to help you long term? Well, and after about 45 minutes, he came up with some good reasons why a philosophy degree would work for him. He's currently got a computer programming degree and works for Apple, and he's doing wonderful. But, he struggled for quite a few years, and we butted heads quite a bit because I wanted him to buckle down and do it, and he just wasn't ready. So, that to me is, and again, not every white kid has, I'm thinking the advantages that my kids did, so that kid should be able to be a success also, along with the Latino and, all the other different groups who don't have that strong home life to help them be a success.
I see Mary and Cynthia, but I just want to affirm what Mark is saying from my perspective. The beauty of financial need is that it does an excellent job of proxying, not just for ability to pay, but it does an excellent job of proxying for the support and the environment that individual has grown up in, as well as much of their current circumstances. What kinds of stressors do they have? My point on racial is really just because that data is available. That is race and gender and financial need are the only things you're going to get out of a university at an aggregate level. They don't do sexual orientation. They don't do neurodiversity. All of those are just, we can't deal with them, to Scott's question. Mary, and then to Cynthia.
I think we need to be careful on the gender, because U of O has seen a dramatic drop in women going into accounting. Our classes, our 211 classes, are predominantly male, up to like 75 to 80%, which is
Oh my
scary.
God. Where are the women going? Science?
I don't know. But it's just, I'm just saying we got to be aware of that. And it takes them, I agree with Martin 100%, that you don't see the women in the higher positions, because they get diverted off into quality of life, and they get diverted off and they have kids and all of that. So there can be stuff, but the pipeline, at least what we're seeing, we've got 550 kids going in this fall that took accounting classes, and I would say at least 75% were male. And I can track down those numbers exactly, but it was significantly more than we were expecting. And I do like the idea of adding a criteria about a first generation college student. That would be nice. And I think that addresses some of the issues about support. Okay.
I think PSU might ask first gen. I'm pretty sure we do. We might be unique in that. But that's actually because we do report statistics on first gen. So I assume I should be able to get that. And that could be something that we request as one of the criteria that the scholarship application have. Cynthia?
We can have, I'm sorry, one other thing. We can have, are we talking one scholarship or we can do 3 scholarships that address different issues?
I don't think we've gotten that granular.
Okay.
I think what we're really focusing on now are what are the questions that we want to ask to demonstrate success of the program, and a big piece of that, I mean, you're just pumping money out, but some of it is who gets the money, and are we getting, it's really like on a search. When you're doing a search and you want to factor in diversity in your search, you have to get a diverse pool. And you want to make sure, and so that's part of what we want to be able to track is say, of those people who apply for this, they have all these attributes that, I mean, my hope is the way this call goes out for students is it attracts a more diverse pool than exists at the population of schools out there.
Yeah. If I may, and Marilyn, actually feel free to raise your hand because you had a really excellent point here in the chat, which we are, even though we're not supposed to be using that, but just you can really raise your hand, Marilyn, if you have something substantive. Because what Marilyn actually made me aware is that she says that OSU is asking for first gen.
Okay, so probably all the schools are then. I just looked at the clock. I can't believe it's 9:27. Are we able to go a little bit longer since we started late? Oh, fantastic. So let's make a target. I think we started at, it was either 8:12 or 8:14. I can't remember. I think it was 8:14. So let's plan on going till 9:45. Okay. Cynthia, you had some comments that you wanted to make. Mary, are you good? Okay, your hand was still up. That's why. Okay, Cynthia? Whoops, you're muted.
I don't know how to take it down. I tried to take it down.
It'll come down eventually.
Oh, okay.
Thanks to Mary for asking the first generation. That's so important at a community colleges. That's a big criteria for a lot of things that we do, a lot of our wraparound programs, and where we're trying to broaden the students that are becoming successful in college. So that was great to hear that. I just wanted to clarify in my own mind. So this is more of a question. So one thing that we're trying to differentiate is what is the criteria, the scholarships versus what we're tracking afterwards. So the scholarship committee may never know about the race or the identity of a student. That information would never be shared with them. But afterwards, if the student has chosen to fill that out, we would maybe have that information available afterwards for tracking. Is that kind of we're trying to differentiate between those two things a little bit.
Absolutely. I think we need to, I think that's one of, this is a tough, I'm not surprised we haven't gotten as far down our list. These are really tough questions that we're tackling, but I think we've made a lot of progress today. We, at a minimum, I think this is for tracking. All of these questions are for tracking. And I think that's a whole nother question. Is what are criteria for granting scholarships? I think that's a really, really significant discussion. I don't know what can be done, what the desire is to do, and even stepping back from that a bit, how much this committee wants to specify those criteria.
Mm-hmm.
We had some, I mean, I will say personally, I'm one vote on this committee. But the full-time versus part-time, I think, is absolutely critical to achieve these goals. So degree or non-degree is absolutely critical. And we have said financial need should be a preference here. And again, that's something that Martin and I will get a better understanding of how that actually translates onto a scholarship application. But I don't know, maybe they include their FAFSA. FAFSA is objective. Nobody can fault us for using FAFSA data. But yes, I think that's an open question, and that may be one that we defer to our next committee meeting. I feel like if we've got the measurement down today and our overall committee objective, I am calling that a giant success for this meeting because these are tough issues. Other thoughts on that? Should we move a little bit to number 5 and talk a little bit about some of the other things that we think are non-negotiables? Scott, you're laughing. Am I moving too fast?
No, I'm just, it's like, you know, we've got 9 items and we're at 5, so I'm just laughing at.
Oh no, we got 6 knocked off too.
True. But it's just, no, it just.
You know what? These are.
I have no problems with our speed. It just, yeah. These are
I
tough
knew
issues.
this was an ambitious agenda.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know. I mean, is there anything else we want to add beyond as our key topics at this point? Because I am conscious that we only have about half our committee here. So we have allowing scholarship funds to full and part-time students, community college access as well, degree, non-degree, financial need, first gen. I don't know, first gen and rate, first gen, gender, race are the ones really that we're talking about. You can't ask socioeconomic was mentioned. You can't really ask socioeconomic, first of all, because people are very poorly calibrated at self-reporting socioeconomic data. Like that, people don't know people don't calibrate well with that. It's like confidence. People are always overconfident. But the FAFSA and first gen gets us at socioeconomic. Okay, so I'm hearing no more items on number 5. And for the time being, that's not a done deal. Mary, did you still have a question? Okay. Do we want to move on to number 7? Few minutes to talk about that. Martin, can you just mention, you and I had some conversations. So are we at the point where our intent is to move forward instead of saying the granting agency, it should be OSC, we should be saying OSCPA?
I think that for purposes of this committee, I think that I think we can say in the interest of full disclosure, I did uncover that there is a quite frankly rather small and rudimentary scholarship program that essentially has, from what we can tell, no staffing over at OAIA, another organization, but quite frankly, we don't think that there is a real quite frankly, a pathway there for us, given that extremely small construct, for us to do that partnership. That's a conversation I want to have with Sherry about, I want to have a little bit of a side conversation, if at all possible, Sherry, with you about, is there some way that the education, OSCPA and OAIA could partner on some of the scholarship stuff so that we have one clear entity to deal with, because they seem hyper small and kind of focused on very similar things. So it would quite frankly greatly decomplicate us if we had one partner in all of this rather than 2. So that's kind of where I'm at in all of this. I'd kind of like to have just a little bit of an informal conversation with you, Sherry, around that piece. But I do want to be transparent with the committee that I accidentally stumbled across a much smaller version of what OSCPA does over at OAIA. I do also want to put on the radar for the committee, which is more of a technical issue, not about OSCPA specifically, is that when I was working with legal counsel that was assigned by the Department of Justice in the early foundational work for what is allowable and legal in Oregon, I did get very specific advice from DOJ counsel that we should not, in the legislative text, name OSCPA Education Foundation specifically, that it needs to be a little bit more generic. But that's not meant to say that, we shouldn't work with OSCPA. That's more of a legislative language technicality. So those two they're kind of they seem like they're kind of connected to your question, both of them, but they're really kind of two different issues, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that see what you wanted to share with the committee on there, given this was a very informal conversation that you had with OA, the other organization.
Oh, yeah.
And we did do a little, just looking at their website, they do not seem to have a paid staff, and they do have a scholarship program, so that would be volunteer based. They do have board members, but one of the things that is on our agenda here is to the scalability even for OSCPA. Like, what would it take for this to be scalable for OSCPA? So this is enormous. To put it in perspective, OSCPA does about give or take about 100,000, a little more in good years, of scholarships every year, and that's certainly within the scope of their current capabilities. But we're talking about a much larger number, and so just making sure that we set this up for that we're partner with OSCPA to set this up for success, and you guys are the biggest organization in the state for doing this type of work, unless you wanted to try to shift it to specific schools, but that's never been the intent of this. So that's those two to me seem the only viable paths. But you shift it to different schools and then you bring in a whole bunch of other administrative problems. So, and I think it makes it difficult from a community college perspective as well. All right, so with that, so framework for the contractual agreement. Martin, could you, since I'm looking at our time, could you maybe just give us a little background, a little bit more on what you're thinking the key points are, so that we have time to think about that? And then my hope is at our next meeting, we can finalize the items that we've discussed, because all of the board members will have had a chance to review the material and the recording, and then we can go from there and start moving on with number 7 at our next one. Scott, though, before we do that, it looks like your hand's up.
Yeah, I guess I guess a quick blush from Sherry. You've heard all the conversation here about all the potential angles and pools of people we're trying to reach. Just very high level, is that something the foundation, ignoring the dollar amounts, is that something the foundation is capable of tackling in its current processes? And that, I mean, if you're going to say we can't handle it, then we need to take an entirely different direction as a committee.
I mean, getting into some more of this detail today is very helpful. And I think, when we look at this, some of these things are different than our current process. But I mean, from my perspective as staff, and of course, I'm not speaking for the board, but there was interest at the there was excitement about the OSCPA board, which is not the Ed Foundation board, when Martin gave a report to them in September. There was excitement from a few Ed Foundation board members when this hit their radar. We're going to need to make some adjustments, but so far nothing seems totally out of scope in my mind for what we're capable of doing. And then additionally, Elizabeth, from the background, we don't offer currently a lot of community college scholarships, but they are there. Our biggest challenge is we don't get the students applying for them. So I know my family has a community college scholarship that, we're like, oh, nobody applied for this last year. So, it's not out of scope that we would offer community college. I mean, that's a goal as well. We know students move from community college up into university. So.
Yeah, and I think I will tell you just anecdotally that the biggest barrier that I hear from my students is, oh, thanks for sending this, but I'm not full-time. So I think that varies from university to university. UP students are all full-time.
Yeah.
I could see for community college that particularly could be an issue.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's something that we, both Cynthia and I were acutely aware of when we started down this road. So.
Yeah.
All right, great.
Really critical discussion actually for us, because the other framework piece here for us that's directly relevant in that context is that legally speaking, number one, DOJ has been very clear that the board itself cannot be the one actually establishing and operating a scholarship program. Policy-wise, it's also not where the board wants to go. The board was very clear that, you know, it didn't want to get into that business directly, but wanted to leverage existing infrastructure, very much with a look toward OSCPA. So it's a great question that came from Scott, because we do need to make sure that we're not just making a false assumption there. But that's, quite frankly, for us, the hope, right? Because that is what is legally allowed for the scholarship activity to take place outside the board, right? And we hope that we can do it through OSCPA.
Yeah, and I think too, Sherry, if you know, your representative, whoever the representative to this committee is from OSCPA / Ed Foundation, having that person on when we're discussing number 8, the scalability of the current program.
Yes.
You know, I have some thoughts on it, having been on that committee for so many years, but I also am not the one running it. So that would be that conversation really does need to happen with a representative from your shop.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah. Okay. So Martin, do you want to just talk to us a little bit about just high level what some of the items are under number 7 that we should start thinking about to address at our next meeting?
So for me, actually, number 7 directly it's almost duplicative from my perspective, right? Because it actually, to me, directly overlaps with essentially the priorities that we've talked through today in terms of what would be in that framework, what will be the values guiding that framework, right? And the only thing that's not, you know, that I would add under 7 to items that we've discussed today is there was in the very original materials for this committee, and I'm happy to resend it back out, there was a draft contract that was not a draft contract, the final contract that was done between the Washington Board of Accountancy and the Washington Society, not as a we should copy it as is, but essentially to give us an example of this is the level of detail potentially, right? We don't, again, it's not a must, but it's at least a reference point. But that's essentially a, you know, to me, it's at least a guidepost of this is the level of detail that we could or possibly should get to in Oregon for an Oregon version of that, of such a contract. Because we do, you know, I do think we should do that work through this committee and bring a proposed draft through work between OSCPA, Ed Foundation, and this committee to the board. I'd love to do it, if at all possible, before the leg session, so that we can say to the legislature, we're all done and ready to go. All it is need their blessing. Essentially, it's a little bit risky just in case it doesn't come out of the leg session, but it would be really nice if essentially, if we can get this work done before the leg session and we get legislative blessing, that at that point, it's really just wheels rolling implementation land rather than we need to craft something land.
Okay, so that's helpful. Martin, tell me if this is appropriate with under the guidelines of how we should be running these committees. I feel like we've made a tremendous amount of progress on here, and I'm happy to create a summary of where we landed on each of these items. They could then be circulated. You could then circulate back out in advance of our next meeting. So that would give everybody an opportunity, for example, to wordsmith our committee objective, make sure they're comfortable with all the points that we seem to have landed among this subset of our committee, landed pretty well on. Can you do that on this? Is that allowable?
Yes,
Perfect.
we can send out the summary. What we need to do is if people provide feedback to that summary, we need to be really, really careful that it is channeled. It needs to be channeled back to me so that I can assemble it, because otherwise we're going to essentially start discussing substance on email and get into public meeting territory. But there is no problem with you sending something out and saying, if you have comments, send them back to Martin. I can then assemble by X date. I can then assemble them and essentially bring them to you in one sitting.
Fantastic.
It avoids an emailed substantive discussion, which is the part where we get into violations of public meeting law.
I will actually send the summary to you, Martin, and then you can
Okay.
send it out to the
Even
committee,
better.
just because I know how there's a tendency to hit reply on things.
Yep.
And you can emphasize do not reply all. I think you
Yep.
can even set it up so if you do BCC to everybody, they can't reply all.
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, we are a little bit circular in our conversation on this, but I'm not at all surprised. These are really tough issues. They're the kinds of things we grapple with all the time in education. And it takes a while to get these out. All right, so we are at 9:46, so we are 1 minute over when I said. So I believe we should now be adjourning our meeting unless anybody has any final comments or business.
Can we very briefly talk about our next meeting time?
Yes. These are really hard. I think this was particularly tough because we are out, we're heading into the holidays. Fridays generally, I think, are best for everybody. Is that correct? I know Claire, for example, doesn't teach on Fridays, but she had Friday finals.
Yeah.
So could we target, I know I have some travel in January. 26th potentially. I'm out on the 19th. I'm traveling on the 19th. So we would either be looking, and I'm out at well, no, I could do the 12th or the 26th. Do those work for your calendar, Martin?
I will make them work. That's my job. It's really for the committee to give feedback, because my calendar is your calendar.
Okay, I will then send out, I'll do that today. I'll send out a doodle poll to the group for various time slots. And is everybody comfortable with us continuing on Zoom?
Yes.
Okay, and it's very convenient. It seems to work very well. So, all right. With that, it is now 9:47 and the meeting is adjourned.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Have a great
everyone.
break.
Okay. Elizabeth, can you stay on for a sec?
Yes. And I
Um,
just realized I can